Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining me here today. And for those of you who are listening for the first time, welcome. I'm going to warn you that this episode may make you angry, but I'm hoping it will also motivate you to advocate for change. My guest today is Dr. Bibi Pirayesh, and it is her second time on the podcast. And it's really hard for me to believe that she fell into educational therapy by accident. But not only is she an extraordinary ed therapist, she's an extraordinary advocate for students with learning challenges and disabilities. And after listening to our conversation, you will see why learning disabilities is a social justice issue, why the system, which does not always allow for different ways children learn, needs to change. We are getting into it today, so buckle up.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, Bibi. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yay. Hello. Thank you for having me back. I'm so excited.
You were one of the first people I interviewed when we started the podcast. I think you might have been episode 3 or 4.
It was pretty early on, yes. And look at what you have done, how incredible this podcast is and this community that you've built. We're also so grateful for everything that you do.
It's so amazing. I think we're 95 episodes in right now at the time of recording. Can you believe that? It's unbelievable. But such great conversation, such important work that we're sharing and information. And, I just, like I said, I think when we first started is that it's about sharing information that can change lives, right? And getting everybody on board to support diverse learners and students with disabilities. And I just want to thank you for being part of it because it's just been a great journey so far.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me be part of it. I mean, when you started, I don't think any of us knew the direction that things were going to go into. And I think that, having your voice and the community that you've built throughout this incredibly difficult time has been that much more important.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And you and I have been talking through this before the pandemic, when we talk about the last 2.5 years and during the pandemic. And now, we're still in it.
Yep.
We're not out of it. This is no post-pandemic conversation.
No, we're still very much in it. Maybe it's like even worse now than it's been in a while. So yes.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Well, the reason why I wanted to have you back on the podcast is because, I think when we started our conversation, we were talking about the social justice issues related to learning disabilities. And you and I have spoken a great deal about the fact that learning disabilities is a social justice issue. I think we had that conversation at Chin Chin with Heather and some of the other people as well. And it's just such an important message to get out there, at a time when everybody's talking about social justice issues in general. But I don't want the learning disabilities part of that to get lost because it's so important.
Yeah, I think, social justice has been really trendy for, a while now, a few years now. And then now it's become so politicized, the idea of social justice. And like with everything that has been happening in terms of, the big debates about critical race theory and, censoring books and what teachers can say in classrooms. And it, oftentimes, as a lot of things are in our country, it's very much based around race. I think after Roe recently, there was some attention that was obviously brought to it in terms of gender and sex. But one thing that I actually think connects all of these different components is ableism. Uh, and we don't really, I don't think we really talk about that enough, and we don't think about that enough in our, not just in our society, but in our education system. I think we might, now with COVID and the ways in which it has and will most likely continue to disable people, I think maybe it'll become more a part of our consciousness. But I think we're still not really talking enough about the ways in which our education system and our special education system at its core is based on a very ableist ideology. And so, a lot of the work that I do, when I work with teachers, et cetera, it's usually around helping them see that, the reason that sometimes it feels like you're hitting your head against the wall and things are not working, it's because you're actually in a system that's set up to be that way. And the more we gain awareness of that, and for ourselves and for our students, the more, at first you sort of go through this huge grieving period, but eventually you get to a place where you can feel a little bit more empowered in taking steps to shift that. So, I think that this idea that, everything that the entire system is set up to say who can do better, who can think better, who is more intelligent, who is less intelligent. This is our kind of like our standard, and you fit it. And if you don't, then we're going to say there's something going on with you. There's something wrong with you. So we throw around a lot of language like neurodiversity or universal design. But none of that ever really truly sticks because the systems in place are not based on that kind of ideology. They're based on a very ableist ideology.
Right. And I think it's really important to talk about that and unpack that, because when you talk about ableism, for people who may not understand, you're really talking about systemic ways of marginalizing and excluding people who are not neurotypical, who are not able-bodied. And you actually argue that it's really the heart of the social justice issue as we see in education.
Yes, the systemic ways in which we end up marginalizing, I think, are a byproduct. I think the issue at the core is the same issue at the core of racism, the same issue at the core of sexism. The issue at the core is our ideology. And I think one of the things that's happened politically in the country, it's been happening always, but it's really come to the forefront now, are these questions about what is that ideology? And the ideology is white supremacy. And it sort of fuels, all the different isms. But I really see ableism kind of at the heart of it, because it's the way that our education system is set up, and it's the way in which we indoctrinate students, people from day one in their childhood. Like they go through the school system and they kind of learn that this way of looking at the world is the way. So in critical pedagogy, we talk about the idea of hidden curriculums. We talk about how we're not aware that certain cultural norms are the norms. We just kind of take part in them like fish in water. And that's what happens with our very ableist education system. We just assume that that's the way that it's supposed to be. And we accept that, okay, well, some people are going to be at the top of that ladder and some people are going to be outside of that. And, social justice means we're going to try to give some kind of aid or help to the people who are outside of that. But to me, social justice is about understanding that core, understanding that epistemic basis, that ideological basis, and questioning that and shifting that. Because the way that it is not necessarily the way that it's supposed to be. It's just the way that we built it.
Right. And, we've had this conversation where you said the system is working. I think you said in our last conversation, the system is working exactly as it was designed. And what that means is that as it stands today, the system, the education system doesn't allow for a lot of different ways for kids to learn, which is why so many kids who have neurodevelopmental challenges, learning disabilities, learning disorders struggle in those learning environments because it's not designed for them to do well.
I mean, the system is set up for competition. Our ideology is very kind of Darwinian, or at least, our kind of positivist interpretation of Darwin. So it's survival of the fittest. We have a competitive, and this happens every day. I deal with this in schools where I say, just the other day, I was having a meeting about a student and asking for accommodations. I was asking if the student could have access to certain notes during class. And they were like, well, no, that wouldn't be fair to the other students. And this concept of like, well, okay, but if somebody had a broken leg and they needed to use crutches, would you say that that's unfair to the other students? You wouldn't. But we don't think that way in terms of our schooling. And the reason for that is that our schooling isn't about let's help everyone walk and participate. It's about who's going to win the race. So obviously, if you have a broken leg, like, why are you even here? Why are you even in?
Yeah. Why are you even in the race?
Right. Like, oh my God, we have to like now figure out a way to give you crutches and all of that so you can just sit on the sidelines. So it's really, and that's what drives things. We create a system from the beginning that sets everything up as a competition. And then the purpose is to get into college. And then in college, you're going to compete and then you're going to get into the workforce and then you're going to compete there. It's that you are never going to be able to create any kind of socially just movements in a system that's set up that way, because that's not the point of it. It's, the point is for the competition and at whatever means necessary. So it is functioning as it's supposed to.
Right. And when you talk about that competition between students or between schools, even educational systems, we know that because of the neurodiversity of our students, that some students are at a disadvantage. Like you use the example of the broken leg and needing crutches, right? For many of the students that we work with, the barrier is dyslexia, for example, that they cannot decode, the language that is needed to read. And they need support in order to do that. That's a huge barrier to learning in general. And so what I'm hearing you say is that the system is not even set up to support those students who have the barrier to even compete in the system.
Yeah, I mean, when you read special education law, and I think, with everything that's been going on with the Supreme Court, more and more of us are becoming aware of how important it is for us as citizens to understand these laws and understand how these things function in our society. But when you read special education law, like IDEA, it's really very clear that the way that it's set up is this is our system. It's so unfortunate that some of you are kind of these like outsiders that don't fit, but we're so generous and we're such a good people that we're going to throw you a bone so you don't like completely sink. But we're not actually interested in shifting our systems so that everyone can participate. And that's why, when people talk about diversity and equity and inclusion and all that, it's really just lip service, because we're not shifting our systems at the core. So, in terms of like, for example, what you were saying about dyslexia, I did a talk earlier this week for a group of teachers on the concept of, reading disability as a social justice issue. And it's interesting because, the brain science, as you know, does not, it doesn't support or mirror the systems that we've set up as like, people who are like, there's a reading circuitry in the brain and like there's something wrong with the dyslexic brain. It's just missing this piece and it can't, it's about teaching. Nobody has a reading circuitry in their brain. Some kids are able to pick up on it faster than others, and others need explicit teaching in it, but we all have to build that reading circuitry in our brain. But we don't even interpret the science in the right ways because we're so stuck on this idea of haves and haves not. Like you either have what it takes, you either have the intelligence, you either have the grit, or you don't. And if you don't, like we're going to put you in a little special education class over there, in the corner by yourself, but we're not really responsible for ensuring that you are truly participating, because that's not our ideology.
And I think that's where the frustration comes in for people who feel passionate about this issue, whether that be parents, whether it's teachers, whether it's youth service providers, because I think that like a lot of things, learning challenges, mental health challenges got a lot of press during the pandemic, but this wasn't, like we've said this over and over again, this is not a new issue. The 1 in 5 kids who struggle with learning challenges, with diagnosable learning challenges, mental health issues is not new. That number has not changed, but we became more aware of it during the pandemic, but yet our system still did not shift as a result of our increased awareness of these challenges. We may have thrown more money at it, but a lot of schools are saying, we don't even know what to do with this money that we have to support the students who are struggling.
I mean, I was so, Karen, and you might remember this, but I was so naively hopeful at the beginning of the pandemic when, we were, the situation that we were in was forcing people to look at the realities, and not only the sad realities, like, how many people don't have access or how things impact people of color or kids who are in lower socioeconomic school districts, like how much more they're impacted. That's always been the case. I was really, again, naively hopeful in the beginning that, this was going to, once this becomes apparent to more and more people, then we will have shifts. Even the hopeful things like, oh, look at the way that we were able to overnight, create these virtual classrooms and allow everyone to have access from their homes and, do self-paced learning if students need it. All these things that we had been advocating for so long suddenly became possible. And I was hopeful, but unfortunately, we're seeing that, as things kind of went back to normal, not that they're normal, whatever this new normal is that we're in now. I don't know about you in your practice, but I'm finding myself basically fighting the same battles as before. And what I'm finding is that the battles are essentially ideological. These are ideological battles. And I think that we're seeing that in the larger national sense as well. And that's why, to me, and sort of this difference is not deficit project and, all the work that I try to do in terms of teacher training, parent training, advocacy is around kind of understanding ideology. And the need for shift there, because without it, we're just going to continue to perpetuate the same things, and even something as giant as this pandemic wasn't really able to shift us. I think in some ways it just organically has, but certainly not in the ways that I was hoping to see.
And I agree. I think that I was hopeful as well. And we've made some movements, particularly in the mental health space. I think that we've kind of realized that students need more social emotional support. I mean, it's definitely not equal across the board in terms of who gets support and what that support looks like. But we're still dealing with a lot of the same, challenges that we did before. The data on reading disabilities and the fact that reading disabilities are underdiagnosed and underidentified in children of color, and I think we've said that students who don't learn to read or read proficiently by third grade are at greater likelihood to leave high school without a degree, and then are at increased risk for being in the lower socioeconomic status bracket. That is to me, is an important aspect of this social justice issue, because you're depriving people of an opportunity to participate in society in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. And we know, that dyslexia, for example, is central in the whole school to prison pipeline. Something like 40, maybe even over 40% of people in prisons have a learning disability diagnosis. So we and recently, I don't know if you saw, was a lot of kind of conversation and controversy around changes. For example, the New York Times article by Lucy Calkins, kind of again in this culture war between whole language and phonics and all of that. And I mean, I just, as you know, reading is one area where both science, neuroscience, and education research is plentiful. It's solid. It's clear. We know exactly what's going on. We know exactly what happens. We know exactly how we need to fix it. And yet it doesn't actually happen. So that's where you have to really begin to ask the question of, why doesn't it happen? And that kind of comes back to that larger point about, it's sort of, that's by design that it doesn't happen because we know how to do it.
And that's part of my frustration, is this persistent gap between the science and the practice in what we do in our schools. That we know the science, like you're saying, but then there's this gap in terms of we're not using the science to inform how we teach kids how to read, across the board. And then the other piece of this, which speaks to the social justice piece, which angers me, is the fact that people know this. And I think it was Marianne Wolf who talked about the fact that the Bureau of Prisons projects the number of prison beds that they will need based on third or fourth grade reading statistics. What does that tell you about our society? That we know that this is a problem. We're actually preparing the prison system because we know this problem.
Yeah, and there was some pushback on that where people, were like, no, that's not how we do it. But then when they looked at the research, it was clear that even if that's not how it gets done, it would be a very, very effective and accurate way of making that prediction. So then you have to bring in these larger questions about, our for-profit prison system and all the, news that we hear about forced labor in prisons, and and that connects to things like Roe v. Wade, and why all of these things are relevant to our fields in education. So yeah, I mean, it only gets more, the deeper that you go into it and the more that you understand, the scarier it gets, and the more overwhelming and hopeless. But I can sort of just share my own personal, because many other people, the last few years for me have been very difficult, and the never-ending trauma. I don't think that we realize, yes, it's good to see things, to understand things, to become more conscious of things, but that's really heavy on the system. And the last few years, it's just been happening at such a warped speed. And so much has been happening and has been getting revealed. And it's like one trauma after the other, after the other, after the other. And now we sort of got left, with this last piece with the Supreme Court in the summer. And now they're going to reconvene. And now they're talking about, we have people in our government tweeting things about, overturning Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, it's just, it's really unsettling and scary. But for me personally, and, I definitely have gone through like cycles, up, down, and overwhelm and hopelessness has been kind of in the background for a long time. I think it sort of came in with COVID. At the time when as the pandemic was starting, I was just kind of like launching this initiative, and there was so much vigor and hope behind it, and then it just all went, downhill. But what I'm finding now in my own personal journey is not coming back up to any kind of normal, not coming back up bigger or better, not coming back up, but rather finding just a much more lower but even keeled, calmer approach that's aware of everything that's falling around us. And I really do worry about our education system. I do think that the education system is slowly being dismantled in different ways, and we're pushing towards privatization, etc. But what I'm finding is there's never been, like there is now, the opportunity for small grassroots conversations, advocacy in communities, with individual teachers, with individual schools, talking about things and having there be a receptivity to it, because everybody else kind of feels that too. So there is I'm finding myself kind of, these little sprouts of hope for small change, for small conversations like this, because it is in conversations like this that really, for every single person who's able to reflect on their own thinking, on their own ideology, that's gonna have ripple effects, and that's really the only way forward that I'm seeing right now. But it gives me the hope that I need. It gives me the hope that I need to sort of get up every day and do the work.
And I agree. And I feel that as well. I feel that having these conversations, like you said, and I think it's like having these conversations with different people. And then I think collectively what that looks like and what that means when we're all having these conversations, because I feel like being in the position that we're in, having the knowledge that we have, and our experience working with kids and families and interacting with schools, puts us in a unique position to really participate in change and be agents of that shift, that social shift, that social change, that cultural change. And I agree with you. It does take these grassroots efforts to make that change. And it may not be one big seismic shift, but enough of those small changes, whether it be interactions with teachers, then interactions with schools, and interaction with school districts, and interactions with, states. I think the change is absolutely possible, and I'm hopeful about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, like for me, there's really no agenda anymore. Like I'm not even thinking like, oh, let's do this in order. There's almost like no intentionality even anymore, because I think it's sort of like, I was explaining it like this to a friend the other day. It's sort of like when everything is destroyed and all hope is gone. And then you sort of get up and you're like, okay, well, I still am here. I still am here. I still need to do something. And so you just begin to do the things almost for like your own preservation. But because it's crumbled and you're sort of like thinking anew and building anew, there is possibility. There's possibility. And when you then turn to the person next to you and you kind of look to each other and you talk about that with each other, I think there's a ripple effect. But I don't, I mean, I don't even, I think that even in the ways that people are like us are thinking and working in our businesses, it's shifted. I don't, I don't even look at, I sort of wake up in the morning and I think about what is the work that is going to help sustain me, as opposed to what do I need to do for the health of my business. Like I can't even think that way anymore. And that's a scary thing. But I also think ultimately, if we're trying to move towards more humanistic ways, that's a good shift.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I felt that shift too, probably right at the beginning of COVID, is how can I reach more people? How can I be more helpful to more people outside of my practice? Right. And I think that having these conversations, like you're saying, and it also makes you feel less isolated and siloed in your own thoughts about, the difficulties that many of the kids we work with face, or the barriers that they come up against, because oftentimes if those barriers are removed, they'd be just fine. Right. And it's the system that puts the barriers in place that keeps them from, reaching their full potential. But having these conversations, sharing what it is that we know, and, connecting with people who want to bring about change gives me hope.
Yeah, it's words are transformative, and I think conversations like this are cathartic, for us, hopefully
Right.
for others who are listening. I think just kind of knowing that we're all kind of feeling this and sort of in this together, and trying our best, and there for each other, there to lend a hand to each other. I think these are hopeful things in a society that's really built usually around how do I step on you so that I can get ahead.
Right. And having these conversations is not enough. We know, I was telling you when we first started that I had a conversation with Lindsay Recknell, who talks about the science of hope, but behind hope, there has to be some action as well. It's not about just the feeling or the belief that something will magically change. It's like knowing that you're a part of doing your part in this process and moving things forward is important. So it's not enough to have the conversations. It's about what we're doing, which brings me to your social justice initiative, the Difference is Not Deficit project. I'd love for you to tell me about that, because I feel like you are doing things. You're not just talking about this as an issue. You're actually working toward change.
Yeah. So, the initiative was originally it sort of came about because in the pandemic, we were all so isolated. And I was looking at my students and their parents and teachers, and everyone was kind of like drowning in their own separate pool. And the idea was to try and connect people. But, now with the shifts that we're going through, what I'm really hoping we can do is to try to get people to tell their stories of how they come up against the system and what that feels like, whether they are coming up against it and failing, or coming up against it and having a small victory. And when I say people, that could be anybody. That could be people like us, that's students, that's parents, that's teachers. And really trying to understand by reflecting on our own experiences this concept of what is the ideology. So when I was in that IEP meeting with that, for that student, and I thought I was advocating for them. Was I really advocating for them, or was I actually advocating for the system? Because I was saying, well, this is the way that it is. So now we need to think about how you're going to meet the standards of the system. And it's not that you can necessarily shift that overnight, but just gaining the consciousness, the self-awareness of, oh, okay, no, actually what I was doing was quite ableist. And it wasn't about what the student needs. It's about what the system needs and how the student is going to fit in there. So really it's about, and we have a little PDF freebie on our website now that moves you through 10 questions to ask yourself, to really begin to uncover ableist ways in which we all think, because that's what we're socialized in. And then to take that and think back on your experiences or on your practice, and then think about, okay, so, where did I see this happen? Where could I have done something differently, or where did I do the right thing but forgot to, really give myself credit for that, for standing up for myself or what's right, and then to hopefully get people to share those stories, because when enough of us are able to share our stories of both success and defeat, then we can understand that we're really in this fight together.
Absolutely. I love that. And I've definitely put a link to that PDF and to a place where so parents or educators or professionals can go and share their stories on the website.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. That is wonderful. Bibi, I could keep talking to you forever and ever because there's so much to unpack and so much to discuss. And, I don't even think we can even answer the question of what do we need to do to create a more just educational system, because I think that there's so many moving pieces and so many stakeholders that we need to bring into that discussion. But I think it's a discussion that needs to take place. But for right now, you're doing your part above and beyond. And I appreciate you as a friend, as a member of the Child Nexus community, and for all you do to not only support diverse learners, but to bring about, like I was saying before, that social and cultural change that is absolutely necessary for us to move forward as a society. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much.
I am so grateful to Dr. Pirayesh for coming on the podcast today. If you would like to know more about her Difference is Not Deficit project, be sure to check out the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.